The year is 1926. On a quiet sugar plantation in eastern Cuba, a child is born, a child who would one day shake the foundations of the world. His name? Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. You could have imagined that this boy, raised in the shadow of colonial exploitation, would grow into the fiery revolutionary who brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Cuba in the 1920s was a land of contradictions, a paradise for the wealthy, yet a prison for the poor, a nation shackled by foreign influence, where American corporations controlled vast swaths of the economy and political power was bought and sold like sugar at the Havana markets. Fidel was not born into poverty, but he was born into a system that thrived on it. His father, Angel Castro, was a wealthy landowner, a man who had climbed his way up from Spanish immigrant to sugarcane tycoon. But young Fidel saw beyond the comforts of his upbringing. He saw the suffering of the workers, the injustice of a system built on their backs. By the time he entered the University of Havana, Fidel was already a force to be reckoned with. Charismatic, brilliant, and unyielding, he immersed himself in the revolutionary ideas sweeping Latin America. He devoured the works of Marx, Lenin, and Martí, each page fueling his burning desire for change. But Cuba was not an easy place to challenge the status quo. The government of Fulgencio Batista, a man propped up by American interests, ruled with an iron fist. Dissent was crushed. Voices of opposition were silenced. Yet Fidel Castro was not a man who could be silenced. In 1953, Castro made his first bold move, an audacious attack on the Moncada barracks. It was a disaster. His ragtag group of rebels was outgunned, outnumbered. Many were captured, tortured, executed. Fidel himself was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but prison did not break him. It forged him. Behind those cold iron bars, Fidel honed his ideology, refined his strategy, and when he was released just 2 years later, he had one mission: to return, to fight, and to win. The revolution was coming, and nothing would stand in its way. November the 25th, 1956, a decrepit yacht named Grandma slices through the darkness, carrying 82 men toward the shores of Cuba. Among them, Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, and a young Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara. Their mission? To overthrow a dictator? Their chances? Almost none. Fidel had been here before. 2 years earlier, he had walked out of prison, exiled to Mexico, where he plotted his return. Batista's regime was stronger than ever, backed by Washington and flush with cash from casinos, brothels, and American corporations. But Castro was no longer just a rebel. He was a symbol, and symbols do not die easily. The landing was a disaster. The boat ran aground in the wrong place, in knee-deep mud. Batista's forces were waiting. Within days, most of the men were dead, gunned down in the sugarcane fields, their bodies left to rot as a warning. Only a handful escaped into the mountains, including Fidel, Raul, and Che. 12 men, that's all that remained, 12 against an army. But in these mountains, Fidel found his strength. The campesinos, the poor farmers, sheltered them, fed them, joined them. Slowly, the rebellion grew. Guerrilla warfare became their weapon. Hit and run, strike and disappear. Every victory, no matter how small, was a spark in the tinderbox of Batista's Cuba. This was not just a war of bullets, it was a war of ideas. Castro's speeches, smuggled out on radio broadcasts, reached the cities. Students, workers, even disillusioned soldiers began to listen. The revolution was no longer just a fight, it was a movement. Batista's grip was slipping. His corruption was too brazen, his brutality too much even for his allies. The US began to withdraw support. And then, Santa Clara. In December 1958, Che's forces took the key city of Santa Clara. The regime crumbled. On New Year's Eve, as Havana celebrated, Batista fled, stuffed a suitcase with gold, and vanished into the night. Fidel's voice, archival audio, triumphant. Compañeros, the tyranny has fallen. The revolution has triumphed. January 1st, 1959. Fidel Castro entered Havana like a messiah. The people adored him. The world watched. But the hardest test was yet to come, because revolutions are easy. Governing, that is the true war. Victory was sweet, but now came the reckoning. The revolution had promised justice, but justice, Fidel Castro would soon learn, is a blade that cuts both ways. The executions began within weeks. Hundreds of Batista's officers, policemen, informants, shot in the trenches of La Cabaña fortress. Che Guevara, the revolutionary saint, signed the death warrants himself. This, he said, is not vengeance. This is necessity. Washington recoiled. The The American press called him a butcher. The CIA opened a file, and in the halls of power, a question was whispered. How far would this radical go? Further than anyone imagined. Land reforms stripped plantations from the rich. Factories were handed to workers. American businesses, worth billions, were confiscated overnight. In Washington, President Eisenhower froze Cuban assets. The break was coming, and both sides knew it. Plots began. Poisoned cigars, exploding seashells, a mafia hitman hired in Miami. Castro survived them all. Paranoid, guarded, always one step ahead. But the greatest threat wasn't a bullet. It was an idea. One that would turn Cuba into a pawn in a global game of nuclear brinkmanship. Because as America turned its back, another power reached out. The Soviet Union. Khrushchev saw opportunity. Here, just 90 miles from Florida, was a revolution begging for a patron. Oil, weapons, economic aid, Moscow gave it all. And in return, Cuba would become something far more dangerous, a communist dagger aimed at America's heart. But the real cargo wasn't grain or tractors. It was the seeds of doomsday. They came in the dead of night, crated in unmarked containers, disguised as agricultural equipment. But beneath the lies and the canvas wraps, the truth was undeniable. Soviet R-12 nuclear missiles, each capable of obliterating Washington in a flash of radioactive fire. Khrushchev's gamble was audacious. 42,000 Soviet soldiers and technicians, 36 warheads, all planted secretly just 90 miles from American shores. For Fidel, it was protection against invasion. For Moscow, a game of atomic poker with the highest stakes imaginable. October 14, 1962. A routine reconnaissance flight. Major Richard Heiser's U-2 camera snapped 928 photos over western Cuba. When analysts saw them, the White House went into lockdown. President Kennedy's voice, archival audio, grim. This is an offensive buildup with one purpose: to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. The calculus was terrifying. If launched, these missiles could kill 80 million Americans in under 15 minutes. Kennedy assembled his advisors, the XCOM, in secret. Options were few. Negotiate, too weak. Invasion, risked Soviet retaliation. Airstrikes, might miss missiles, guaranteeing nuclear war. Secretary McNamara, archival audio, shaken. Mr. President, we're talking about the possible death of 100 million people. Then, the blockade. On October 22nd, Kennedy went on television, his voice steel. U.S. warships formed a 500-mile barrier around Cuba. Any Soviet vessel crossing it would be fired upon. The world held its breath. In Moscow, Khrushchev raged. In Havana, Castro demanded defiance. And on the high seas, freighters, Alexandrovsk and Bucharest, steamed toward the line, one carrying nuclear warheads, the other a decoy. October 24th, the moment of truth. Soviet ships slowed, then stopped, the first step back from oblivion. But in Cuba, the missiles were already operational, and Fidel Castro was writing a letter that would push the world closer to the abyss than ever before. What Castro proposed next would shock even Khrushchev. If they invade, strike them with everything we have. Castro's words weren't a suggestion, they were a demand. The most dangerous letter in history was being drafted at this very moment, a plea for Khrushchev to launch nuclear missiles at America. First, Castro's voice, dramatic reading, fiery. The imperialists must understand, if they invade Cuba, we must wipe them from the face of the earth. Even the Soviet premier was stunned. This wasn't the plan. Khrushchev wanted deterrence, not Armageddon, but events were spiraling beyond anyone's control. October 27, Black Saturday, the day the world almost ended. Major Rudolph Anderson's U-2 violated Cuban airspace for just 12 minutes. The order came directly from Castro: shoot it down. In Washington, the Pentagon went to DEFCON 2, one step from nuclear war. 1,400 bombers armed, ICBMs fueled. Kennedy's finger hovered over the button. Then, a miracle. Khrushchev's second letter had arrived. The terms? Remove U.S. missiles from Turkey, pledge not to invade Cuba, and the Soviets would stand down. But Castro didn't know. As Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated, Cuban forces were ordered to fire on any low-flying U.S. planes. At 7:45 p.m., radar operators in Havana saw blips approaching Guantanamo Bay. The crews waited for the order. The world balanced on a razor's edge. Then, nothing. The planes turned back. A message from Moscow had arrived just in time. October 28, the deal was struck. The missiles would leave Cuba, but the scars would never fade, and neither would Fidel's fury. The world breathed a sigh of relief. The missiles were going home, but what the cameras didn't show? The secret deal that made it happen, and the revolutionary leader who felt stabbed in the back. Fidel wasn't consulted, wasn't warned. The two superpowers had negotiated over his head, like colonial powers dividing spoils. For the proud Cuban leader, this humiliation burned deeper than any embargo. But the secrets went deeper. Kennedy had secretly promised to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a fact kept hidden for decades to save face. Even more explosive, the Soviets left behind 100 tactical nukes, only retrieving them weeks later when Washington accidentally discovered the deception. And then there were the real survivors of the crisis. Not the politicians, but those who came closest to ending the world. Soviet officer, we were this close to firing our nuclear torpedo at your ships. Only one man refused the order, Vasily Arkhipov. You should thank him, you're alive. The ultimate irony, while Castro raged, his people were already paying the price. The US embargo tightened like a noose. Soviet subsidies became Cuba's lifeline, and in Washington and Moscow, a realization they needed rules for this dangerous new game, Kennedy's voice. In the final analysis, we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. When the shot rang out in Dallas, even Fidel froze. His great enemy, gone. The crisis had ended, but the Cold War's longest feud was just beginning. They tried to kill him with shellfish toxins, with botulism-laced cigars, even with a exploding seashell planted where he liked to snorkel. After the missile crisis, America's war against Fidel Castro didn't end. It just went underground. The CIA got creative. They recruited the mafia. They poisoned his milkshakes. Once, they even considered dusting his shoes with thallium salts to make his beard fall out, because apparently, even spies thought revolutionaries needed proper grooming. Castro's voice. If surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic sport, I'd win the gold medal. Through Vietnam, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Castro endured. Soviet subsidies vanished. The economy collapsed. People ate zoo animals to survive. Yet every time the world wrote his obituary, he'd appear on state TV, giving a 12-hour speech just to prove he could, in the end, not the CIA, not exile militants, not even time itself could claim him quickly. When death finally came in 2016 at age 90, half of Miami celebrated while Havana mourned. The revolution outlived its maker. The missiles are gone. The Cold War is over. But walk these streets today, and you'll still hear the echoes in the salsa rhythms that mask rebel songs, in the faded propaganda peeling from walls, in the stubborn resilience of a people who once held the world hostage and lived to tell the tale. This is the past unfolded.